Hello and good day, everyone. You are tuning in to the Undeniable Podcast, an ambitious foray into the exciting, yet not often enough explored world of excellence in the Virgin Islands. I am Shea Alexander, the host of this series of exciting conversations, and I am the founder and principal consultant of OAC Group, a multidisciplinary consulting firm offering strategic growth and business development solutions. Undeniable has been curated for those keen to learn from individuals at the height of their career. Together, we'll enjoy frank discourse and unpack what it means and takes to be great undeniably. Undeniable leans on OAC Group's extensive network of clients, partners, and friends to feature an impressive roster of industry leaders and brilliant minds in riveting unscripted conversations monthly. So today I am joined by Dr. Richard Georges, and as I normally do, Dr. Georges, what I like to allow people to do is give their own introduction just to make sure I don't avoid any critical information and just to make sure that you get as comfortable as you possibly can. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Richard Georges, the author, the president, and whatever it is you think is relevant to the conversation we're going to have today.
All right, thank you very much, Shay. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Richard Georges, obviously, president of Lavity Stoutt Community College, a proud alumnus as well of the same institution. I'm also the inaugural Virgin Island Poet Laureate and a writer of poetry, fiction, and essays. I think one of the things that we're going to talk about today is also my capacity as not just in terms of a writer, but also as a literary programmer / activist, you could say. And in that respect, I am the founding editor of Moco Magazine, which is a regional publication focusing on literature and art of the Caribbean, the geographical Caribbean, mind you, as well as one of the founders of the BVI Lit Fest. So I think those are the main aspects of me that are relevant to today's conversation.
Okay, so one of the first things I want to jump at, well, there's one very simple one just to make sure I'm following. When you say the geographical Caribbean, what does that mean? Does that mean the islands, or does that mean the whole region inclusive of the landlocked areas?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So it's an interesting conversation because I founded that magazine in collaboration with David Knight Jr., who is a writer and art curator based in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And our initial thing was to make sure there was a Virgin Islands located platform for writers and artists. But there's a paucity of platforms in general in the region. But I'm also very wary in the ways in which we reduce ourselves. And so it's a very reductivist approach that we kind of tend to take when we speak about the Caribbean, and we focus on the Anglophone Caribbean primarily, whereas the majority of Caribbean citizens and residents are Hispanophone.
Okay.
So for example, when we look at the Caribbean, we also have to consider, for example, the Caribbean coast of Central and South America.
Okay.
And then, of course, the archipelago itself.
Okay.
So that's the interpretation we take for Moco Magazine.
Okay. So I will say to my listeners here, Dr. Georges this is the 4th episode of the podcast. Each episode has 2 parts. But Dr. Georges is technically my 3rd guest. And no offense to you, Dr. Georges, but I apologize to my listeners for the fact that I have brought on some extremely articulate guests so far. So my first was Dr. Rubin. My second was Dr. Smith, and now I have you. And you guys are all people who have very, very large vocabulary. So if the people listening have to take some time to familiarize themselves with some new words, that's absolutely fine. That's the nature of learning. But the other thing in the introduction that I wondered if you would say, and this is the reason I tend to like to have people introduce themselves, because it's always interesting to me, the things that they choose to include and the things that they don't choose to include. So Dr. Georges, one of the things that I was able to confirm in our preamble of a conversation just now is that obviously you are the president of the college, but you're also relatively young to be the president of the college, presumably. And of course, I don't fact check. I don't have a team to do that. I'll probably do it at some point. But you probably were the youngest person to sit in this position, even now, a couple of years in. What has that looked like for you from the context of the actual reality of what you're doing? Has it brought challenges? Has it brought opportunities? Has it brought a different perspective? How has it influenced your leadership at the college?
I would say all of the above.
Okay.
I would say interacting with students and makes me feel a bit older than I am
Yeah.
very quickly.
Yeah.
But I would say all of the above because I think I'm able to bring a fresher perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe also I would say um, sometimes you don't know that the thing that you're trying isn't supposed to work,
Mm-hmm.
because you lack that conventional
Mm-hmm. Wisdom.
wisdom,
Yeah.
but then the thing works.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes that youth, in terms of, I wouldn't say lack of experience, but I think that youth reduces some of the fear
Mm-hmm.
that you might have
Mm-hmm.
if you, you know, are a bit too wary or a bit too suspicious
Yeah.
of new things.
Yeah.
I think for
Yeah.
my part, I'm willing to receive new ideas, new concepts,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps listen to a wider range of people
Mm-hmm.
about what could be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm not sure that's necessarily my youth per se, but my general outlook
Yeah.
is to be a bit more um, open
Mm-hmm.
and a bit more willing to take calculated risk.
Yeah. So I think that is normally the balance that comes with being younger. On the one hand, you have what can be seen as a bit of a carelessness in terms of willingness to do new things and to be less suspicious, more risk tolerant. But on the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, that brings an ability to introduce fresh paradigms and perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
ideas to an institution that may not have been the norm,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes break convention in a very positive way, and obviously sometimes break it in a way that you kind of have to do some cleaning up after. Um, are there any specific things? So, as somebody in the BVI's audience, because BVI is a very small place, so most of us get to have the opportunity to pay attention to nearly everything that's happening. Um, I have noticed that the college has undergone a lot of things that seem to me to be a deliberate introduction into sort of like a new era.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I
Mm-hmm.
know they did the rebranding. I believe that was under your stewardship.
Yes.
So you went away from more of like a heritage brand and more to something that was a bit more modern.
Yes.
And I know there've been a lot of like continuing education things, professional development things under your stewardship as well. Are there any specific initiatives that as a young person you have really brought and that are actually a reflection of the fact that I wanted to try something different or you wanted to try something different?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say definitely the rebranding was something that I felt
Okay.
was essential.
Okay.
And I think we retained the old identity as the seal of the board.
Okay.
And so that still appears on, for example, diplomas, correspondence to the board, etc. But I
Okay.
felt it didn't, its legibility was something that was a concern, both literal and figurative,
Yeah.
was a concern
Yeah.
because we needed an identity that could track not just locally anymore,
Mm-hmm.
but if the college was to have a more expansive,
Mm-hmm.
a more inclusive, a more um, accessible um, um, impression
Mm-hmm.
on new and future stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
it needed to be much more visibly accessible.
Okay.
And so that was the impetus behind the rebranding.
Mm-hmm.
That's one section. I think the other thing that I took very careful stock in and sort of a very deliberate approach was I think you hinted at it, was some of the workforce development
Yeah.
sides of things. So we spent a lot of time and what resources we had access to
Mm-hmm.
in marine and maritime,
Yes.
um, in the Center for Professional Development.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say, and more dramatically in the past year and a half, the Robert Mateus Institute,
Okay.
which is something that for us, it was obviously, I think we had the year that we had the big honoring the commission did of
Mm-hmm.
Mr.
The
Matavius.
house that Matavius built.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And in that um, time, in collaboration with a number of other stakeholders, we were able to lobby for the then Financial Services Institute to
Mm-hmm.
be renamed in his honor.
Yeah.
And that was coupled with a number of other things, including uh, a repositioning of the institute in terms of the college internally,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and a redesign and restructuring of the institute,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of better place it
Mm-hmm.
to serve, not only serve the needs of the sector a bit more effectively and efficiently,
Mm-hmm.
but also to be blunt, to be a more effective revenue generating arm of the
Yeah.
college.
Yeah.
I think we are well on our way in that regard for that
Mm-hmm.
becoming a success.
Okay. So, not to accuse you of stumbling around, but it would appear to me, at least from the outside looking in, that there has been a great deal of intentionality in terms of best aligning the college and the output of the college being specifically the students with the actual needs of the BVI economy, the human capital pool that we have to cultivate
Yes.
here. So obviously you have seen, or I have seen, or we have seen a lot of investment into the culinary and hospitality area, which obviously
More to
feeds
come.
right into tourism.
Yeah.
The marine side, which also feeds into tourism, and obviously, like you just mentioned, the RMI, which feeds into the financial services sector. As a younger person myself, and this is of course no fault of your own, I do wish that we had started doing that a bit earlier. I think that there was somewhere in the BVI's development where the really bright minds, the really forward-thinking minds, I think we replaced them a little too quickly with what I call the maintainers. So we started into an era of maintenance when we had not quite laid the entirety of the foundation. There were a lot of really brilliant people that did a lot of work to develop financial services, tourism, the legal infrastructure of the BVI, the physical infrastructure of the BVI. Even when you read about some of the entrepreneurs that existed here, but the middle point, which is ensuring that that is passed down generationally from the education system in particular, seems to have been neglected. And so I feel like that's why we kind of are playing catch up now, because we were in a valley. I think the minds that are there right now to carry us back up on a mountain, I just don't know if the framework encourages that sort of thinking. But how intentional was that in terms of making sure there was that alignment with education and the workforce?
Well, extremely, extremely. And it's also important to note that you need to have the right people in your governing body as well to make sure that, when these initiatives are developed and proposed, etc., that that body is supportive.
Yeah.
And understanding of even if everything's not right or perfect, but the understanding of the need for the efforts for that growth to continue. What I would say is that I think I'll go back to the first point talking about a certain lack of fear, and a certain comfort with some measure of failure. Not everything you try is going to work, and just because it doesn't work doesn't mean you need to stop. Right? It means that you need to assess, redesign, pivot, and continue again.
Yeah.
But I think too often, I don't know if you're coining a phrase here about maintainers or gardeners, that when something fails, I think we're too quick to shut everything down, to shut down innovation, to shut down fresh thinking. And that's something I'm very wary of. So I would say it's extremely intentional because the college, is placed in the way it is to serve the nation building interests of the entire territory.
Yeah.
And that can't just be, perennially developing high school graduates into associate degree holders for transfer. Surely they have, it is a much broader mandate than that. And I think the other aspect that we need to be conscious of when we are entrusted with leadership, it's not just that willingness or that willingness not to fail, but you have a responsibility to look at your environmental constraints and to be creative enough to figure out how you navigate around through or past them. I think too often we see the environmental constraints and it's very, very seductive to throw up your hands and say, well, it can't be done. But really and truly what we're charged with doing is figuring it out, because you don't have control of those constraints.
And the reason I said that this is episode 4, and you're my third guest, is because episode 3 was a solo episode, and one of the things I said when I was wrapping it up is that, I don't think I phrased it quite like this, so I'm already started paraphrasing myself, but the idea that I was trying to express was that there is a narrow line between genius and delusion, and I think what separates them is an ability to be aware of the parameters within which you operate and to understand genius is kind of being able to push on the parameters
Mhm.
without falling over the edge, or falling victim to what I can't do anything about it because there's a wall here. But I want to come back or pan back out to the college as a broad concept. And we're going to talk about your own vision a little bit later in this conversation, but kind of wrapping up the whole introduction of yourself, where do you see the college going, and what is your major goal here as the president of the college? With obviously a lot of long-term thinking and plans going on in your head.
Well, I would say the college is a microcosm of the BVI in that it is a place of maddening potential.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it is that I think it could be a deep and abiding frustration because you can just look. I mean, if you have the vision, you can just look and see, well, if this was a little bit different, not dramatically different, it's a little bit different, and this other factor was just turned just so, you know, the place could bloom, blossom, etc. And so that is one of the things that keeps me kind of, you know, going. See if you can influence things to evolve in just that slight deviation from where it is currently. And then as you are able to have that sort of incremental success or integrative success in shifting, you know, more and more people begin to like see through the same lens.
Yeah.
And then that's how you kind of get people to buy in. But you know, it is. I don't think you ever will have everyone kind of buying into the same vision. You know, because you know, as legend has it, people stood up in front of the backhoes when the college was being built, right?
I did not hear that.
So both literally and figuratively again.
Yeah.
But in terms of the vision for the institution, I have to be frank. The vision was laid out. The vision was laid out quite explicitly by the founder.
Okay.
Quite explicitly. I think it has been for a number of factors, right? Both internal and external to the institution, why that vision hasn't been fully realized, right? I think a lot of it has to do with, like I said, that creativity, will, influence, and courage. You know, some of the things, because obviously the factors that slow and quicken, you know, that the development institution, you know, fluctuate from time to time. And so you have seasons when the college boomed and grew, and seasons when it contracted, and seasons when it was kind of just holding. So, you know, I am a person who likes to, even though I'm young and might have fresh ideas, and I'm very much someone who also believes in speaking to those who pass through the seat before me.
Of course.
You know? And so, for example, sometimes it's just for context. Well, why did we do this in this time? What was happening? So, and not that I would necessarily agree wholesale with decisions that were taken, etc. But it's good to have that kind of context.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of the vision that Lavity Stoutt laid down, and I have the physical vision, in terms of the master plan that he designed with the architect John Osman, who designed this building that we're in, and a lot of the physical things that you see are not necessarily new. They had to be tweaked and adjusted for the context that we're in now. But a culinary school, you know, the auditorium, the marine center, all of these things were in that initial drawing from 1989, 1988, 1989. And so for my job, really, when I discovered that, when I became the president, I kind of discovered this trove of plans, and the master plans going back 20 years. You realize that you're really just adding, on, and then
adjusting for context.
Exactly,
like
and see, well, how can I like accelerate? How can I kind of catch us up to where we should have been? And that is the thing where, you know, talking to public officials, talking to the civil servants, talking to private sector folks and other entities, other institutions abroad, and trying to see what we can do through those types of relationships to try and more fully realize the vision that was established back then.
So how you just ended when you talked about essentially stakeholders, and something that you said earlier, I know I did promise we were going to go back to the point or to the previous path that we were on, but there was something that you said that I really wanted to hone in on, which was the idea of incremental change. But more specifically, you talked about the capacity and the need to actually start to bring on disciples or willing participants.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, the way in which, when you are attempting to be pioneering, particularly in small communities, the import that exists around the idea of actually converting people to being understanding of what you're doing, to be even evangelicals for what you're doing, so bringing other people into alignment with your thought process. I sometimes feel like in the BVI we don't get the importance of that. So there's this idea, and I think Dr. Ben and I spoke about this in the first episode of the podcast. There's this idea that, particularly for those of us who've been exposed. I traveled and I went to XYZ thing in London. I come back to the BVI. I spend no time considering context. I spend no time considering the actual needs or attitudes of the people in the BVI. And I make a decision that this is what's best. And I might be correct, but I neglect to actually put the effort into the social part of any sort of change making, which is ensuring people follow along with what it is you want to happen. How important, not even how important, I'm going to actually stick to the practical side of this. What is it that you specifically do to get people to align with what it is you want? And of course, I understand you don't always get it to work, but I know you mentioned the fact that you have a board that's supportive. How do you convince, for example, board members or government officials that this thing that I want to do that is different from what you're accustomed to seeing here, i.e. the Lit Fest, because that's what we're about to talk about, how do you convince people to buy into these very different concepts?
Well, I think it's different depending on, obviously, the level of the stakeholder, right? Because obviously it'll be more granular, more specific, more objective when you're talking to people who you're asking to do the work, right? They need to kind of see it in real terms, real and tangible terms, before they kind of buy in with you. And with those people, so we're talking about interns of the college, looking at heads of department and employees, etc. You know, you not the trick, but the key there is not to be prescriptive, right? Because they're the ones who have to kind of figure out the solutions to the everyday problems that are on the way to solving the bigger problem. So you can't be prescriptive. You can't tell them, well, you kind of have to evidence to them in a real way what the vision is. So, for example, with Lit Fest, you know, in-house, yes, Lit Fest has these wider ideals that it's trying to accomplish with respect to literacy with young people, with respect to developing the literary and cultural development for local writers by bringing in agents and publishers and other successful award-winning writers who are doing what they say they want to do, right? And understanding the role of literature in establishing cultural and national identity. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
So with that, we tie in with the Department of Culture.
Yes.
So with respect to the BVI Lit Fest, is not the same thing as the Vocus Lit Fest in Trinidad or the Calabash Lit Fest in Jamaica or whatever you want to talk about. It has to be its own sort of thing. And because of that, it's sort of there's aspects to it as more like a destination sort of event. So we have the reception is at a beautiful villa, gorgeous sunset. We have the free program on campus for the community. But then we have another Brandywine, of course, another beautiful location. We have the brunch on the Sunday at Long Bay. So there's a destination event aspect to it, which of course is attractive to the tourist board and another one of the stakeholders. Where we can start attracting people, and it's at the start of the tourism season. So one of the reasons, we got some pushback from stakeholders. Why are you doing it in November? Why don't you do it in spring when the weather's more reliable? But see, the regional Lit Fest calendar in the spring is very busy. And you're competing for space, you're competing for writers.
And we're the new kid on the block, so we can't necessarily force our way in.
Right, so that's why we kind of pick there. So depending on the stakeholder, you have to kind of figure out what their priorities, their interests, their, what's going to resonate most with them.
I'm smiling because so a lot of the work that I do as a consultant is a lot of communicating and relationship building and things like that. And one of the things that I've really been able to understand is that fundamentally sometimes people struggle with understanding or trying to understand the actual motivations of Party B. So this morning I had an instance where a client called very disturbed because something that was supposed to happen today could not happen today. And I said to them, you realize that this is not a problem because the person that you're concerned about is not concerned about whether or not this thing happens today. They're concerned about whether or not their boss is concerned. And their boss is not concerned. So all I need to do is reach out to that person to say, hi, just so you know, I spoke to your boss. He doesn't care. But it's not going to happen today. And they're like, okay, fine. And that's exactly how the car went. Okay, no problem. I'm going to go back home. But because there's an assumption of what people's agenda is or their motivation, then you operate on that assumption. You stumble around, wasting energy and wasting time, not actually meeting people's needs and not actually answering their actual critical question, which in that case was, is my boss okay with the change? If yes, I'm going back home. That's it. Don't worry about it. But I wanted to talk to you today about the Lit Fest. So in picking my guests for the podcast series, the two things that I wanted to look at, as I said in the introduction, and I know it sounds a bit grandiose, but you'd remember from my time here, I've always been prone to excess in language. So one of the things I was looking for was people who I consider to be at the height of their career. But another thing that I was looking for is, at least in this first season of 6, I really wanted to get people who are just having wrapped up or just about or in the middle of doing something that is very pioneering. Because, like I said just now, and I've kind of alluded to it, a few of the questions in now, one of the things I think we struggle with here in the BVI is understanding that because it is a developing place, we're very young in a global context as a nation. I say that with air quotes because we are all sorts of different things.
Different conversation.
A territory, whatever. But because of our relative newness, when you look at the different players on a global space, I think that sometimes we forget anything that you want to do here fundamentally is extremely new. Even something as simple as I sell bags. There was nobody else selling bags like that, really. This is something everywhere in the world everybody's doing. And even people in the BVI, they have the bags that I sell. They're just going to get them here. So there's a level of, I think, coaching that you have to do with anything new. And I really want to give people sort of the philosophical framework and the real practical tools for understanding if you want to pioneer in a space, if you want to break ground on something completely different, outside of the actual technical nature of the thing itself, here are the more social parts of what you have to do. So you just talked a little bit about the Lit Fest and some of the key stakeholders. But I wanted to talk about the whole concept of it. I'll admit I fell off of reading. It's very embarrassing, but I did. I've only just started reading again. And when I say that, I literally mean that. I have not, outside of things I've read in relation to work, I have not read in a while. But I've recently restarted, so I'm already 5 books in now. 5 big thick books, and it's good now. After the last couple of days, but I fell off of reading, but I still have always really enjoyed literature and the idea of writing and the idea of expressing yourself, especially in language, because I think because of the fact that words are so constrained, if that makes sense. And I'll try to explain what I'm trying to say. But a word is not like, so if I say something to you, there are a lot of things that you get, like we were talking about the fact that I have a telegraphing face. There's so much beyond the word itself that you can interpret from and kind of glean what I'm really saying off of. But when I write, I have to put the effort into making that word make sense in the chain of words to really express. Exactly. So I've really been really entranced with literature because of that. It's really this extremely simple way of language, of expression, that you then have to tie them together to make them go back to being sophisticated. Does that make sense? Because I know I'm speaking to a literary mind. I want to make sure I'm making sense.
The way I would frame it,
go ahead.
And I think the writer seems to be much more cognizant of this in creative writing than any other form of writing, is that you are in control of the reader. Right? You are directing the reader. And so therefore, rhythm and word choice is essential.
And the economy of words that you use, because you can't use every word, which was my problem when I was in college. I used every word and it became very long. But so what I wanted to talk to you about was the Lit Fest. I have had the real privilege of being a part of the 2 that you've had so far and the one that's coming up right now. But talk to me about what you are aiming for, and also the headspace you were in when you first came up with this concept, I guess now 3 years ago.
More, actually. So I'll let me tackle that first, right?
Well, just give us the history of it.
So as a writer, and I would say I've always been a writer, but in terms of taking it seriously, I would say around 2012 is when I started, like, actively publishing
Mm-hmm.
poems in journals and magazines, etc., and working towards my first collection. And prior to the first collection, I had been shortlisted for a program out of the Bocas Prize Festival in Trinidad,
Mm-hmm.
for emerging Caribbean writers who had not yet published, a book.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went down to the festival, and I had been to things before, um, but I was like the first time, like, seriously, like, okay, I'm someone who's actually interested in becoming a writer,
Mm-hmm.
and here I'm at a literary festival,
Mm-hmm.
and having been shortlisted, I think it was in the top 5. It was a shortlist for the Holic Arvin Caribbean Writers Prize, which is supposed to be like a talent finding
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, and three of the 5 on the list have gone on to publish and win awards. So I think it was pretty effective.
Yeah.
And I just saw it was still a relatively young festival,
Mm-hmm.
but I just saw hundreds of people from all over the region and the world
Mm-hmm.
descending upon a library,
Mm-hmm.
a national library, celebrating all the aspects of literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt, in the best ways, like how I felt as a teenager here
Mm-hmm.
in my literature classes with one of your aunts and one of our shared mentors,
Mm-hmm.
without all of the homework.
Mm-hmm.
So all the fun stuff about the classroom conversations,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
intellectual curiosity,
Yeah.
how literature was reflecting these realities that we
Yeah.
couldn't, and I really, and the type of empathy that you can develop for humanity through literature, which I don't think you can develop through many other media.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, why can't we have this?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't we have this level of discourse? Why can't we have a more developed local literature?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't we have a celebration where people can come off the street, and interact with writers
Mm-hmm.
and think more deeply about
Mm-hmm.
their own conditions and their own lives and
Mm-hmm.
what it means to kind of be alive in this space, in this
Mm-hmm.
place, in this time.
Yeah.
And I think that was something that from 2013, 2015, somewhere around there, was percolating in my head. And later on, after Irma, under MOCO, I'd applied for a grant. I was actually in another forum that was led by the British Council. I
Mm-hmm.
was in Norfolk in the UK, and so I don't know if I was in Norwich in the UK, and it was this forum, and I was able to apply for a grant.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that grant, through MOCO magazine, we did a poetry masterclass for emerging Caribbean writers in 2018, and I did that here. Place was still not yet. It was spring of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So it was less than 6 months
After Irma.
after Irma.
Yeah.
And I was able to fundraise about $25,000 locally, in addition to the grant that I was able to get from the British Council. And we had 8 poets from all over the region. I was able to bring in an incredible poet. His name is Raymond Antrobus to facilitate the master class. I did a little bit of teaching. But that, at the end of it, I collaborated with Department of Culture, which was then led by Luce Smith, who is now Luce Hart Smith, who is now the minister, junior minister for tourism. And so we held the BVI Book Fair, which was a one-off event at the Operation Center, followed by a poetry night. And that, to me, proved it, that this place could sustain a festival. I just had to think a bit more about how it needed to be formed.
Yeah.
And so as I became president, I realized, I was able to utilize the college as the vehicle to create something that I believe can be sustainable. So that after I'm gone, that is a festival, hopefully, that can be, sustained in the longer term for the benefit of the BVI.